Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We are very happy to have you. My name is Annie Black. I am the Director of Programs and Volunteers for the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. I wanted to give one housekeeping note before we get started. At tonight's program, we, as always, very much encourage you to ask questions if you have any. If you want to go ahead and locate your Q&A button, if you are on a computer, it will likely be at the bottom of your screen. If you are on a tablet or mobile device, it might be at the top. But anytime you have a question, please go ahead and tap that button, type your question and send it in. We will save those for the end of the program, but you're welcome to ask at any time. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, to get us started. Mary Pat?
Thanks so much, Annie. Good evening, everyone. As Annie said, I'm Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's program, Holocaust Memory in the Post-War Period. I'd like to start by thanking our wonderful community partners for this program. We sincerely appreciate your ongoing support and for the work of the museum. Faith Forward Dallas at Thanksgiving Square, Legacy Senior Communities, Mosaic Family Services, Reach of Dallas, SMU Human Rights Program, Southwest Jewish Congress, Texas Holocaust and Genocide Commission, and the Family Place. We're so proud to have such wonderful partners. And as always, I'd like to give a special and warm welcome to our museum members. We could not put on programs like this without your support, and we are more grateful for your support than ever during this uncertain year. I'd also like to give a big shout out to our museum board members who are joining tonight. I'm so grateful for all that you do to support the museum. Thank you. We're pleased tonight to present a program as part of our permanent exhibition highlight series, which provides an in-depth look into different parts of our permanent exhibition. Shortly, we will hear about Holocaust memory in the immediate post-war period. Tonight's topic expands upon the journey of liberation explored in our permanent exhibition, a bittersweet moment as the survivors were freed from camps and from hiding places, but left to face a world of unknowns. We are so pleased tonight to welcome two esteemed scholars. Dr. Beth Cohen is a lecturer in religious studies and Jewish studies at California State University Northridge. Her work focuses on the Holocaust and its aftermath, including the intersection of the Holocaust and American Jewry and the appearance of the Holocaust in public consciousness and memory from post-war until today. Her current research focuses on child survivors' post-war experiences. She is the author of Case Closed, Holocaust Survivors in Post-War America, and has served as a consultant for the March of the Living, PBS Frontlines, Memory of the Camps, the Jewish Foundation of the Righteous, and other film and educational projects. And Dr. Atina Grossmann is professor of history at the Cooper Union in New York City. She has numerous publications, including Jews, Germans, and Allies, Close Encounters in Occupied Germany, which was awarded the George L. Mose Prize of the American Historical Association and the Frankel Prize in Contemporary History from the Wiener Library in London. She's currently working on a brief summary volume on women and the Holocaust, rewriting gender and history and memory, and a project entitled Remapping Survival, Jewish Refugees and Lost Memories of Displacement, Trauma, and Rescue in the Soviet Union, Iran, and India. We are so honored to have these bright scholars with us tonight. We will have time for questions at the end of tonight's program, and as Annie mentioned, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to type out and submit your questions. And now I'd like to turn the evening over to our speakers and to our moderator for this evening, Dr. Charlotte Decoster, the museum's Director of Education. Ladies.
Thank you, Mary Pat, for the introduction. Good evening, Dr. Cohen and Dr. Grossmann. Thank you for joining us tonight. Let's dive in right away. And I'm going to open it up with a big question to get started with. Can you each start by talking about the survivor population in the US and Germany in the immediate post-war period? What did the flow of survivors of course, into the US and in Germany's case, out of each country look like? Um, would y'all like to kind of elaborate and talk about that?
Yes, I think I'll start. And you're right. It is a big question and a complicated one. And first of all, I just want to thank the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum for inviting us, and thank everyone who's tuning in this evening for this program. I think it's important to keep in mind that at least initially, the Jewish survivor population in Germany towards the end of the war, and then right after the end of the war in occupied Germany, in Allied occupied Germany, was just a tiny, tiny part of this much larger population of wandering, bedraggled masses of people who had been displaced by the war, ranging from ethnic Germans who were fleeing the advances of the Red Army back into Germany, to prisoners of war who had been taken by the Germans and were trying to straggle their way back home, to forced laborers who had also been freed. It was a huge mass of humanity that was streaming, millions, literally millions, estimates from 7 million to 12 million people who were crowding the roads at a time when the war was just barely over. So we have to keep that in mind, that the Jewish survivors initially at the end of the war in May 1945, April, May 1945, were this really minuscule, as they named themselves very quickly, saved remnant, their Sherit HaPleta, this sort of tragically small remnant. Initially, these were people who were liberated on German soil. So either survivors of camps, many of whom had only recently even arrived in camps like Buchenwald or Bergen-Belsen or Ravensbrück on death marches from the East, some of whom had been performing forced labor, but really maybe at most between around 70,000, some estimates are a little higher, 90,000 Jews were liberated from the camps. If you think about a place like Buchenwald, and maybe 20,000 people were liberated alive. Of those, only about 4,000 were Jewish, just to give you a sense. And of that population, a tragically significant proportion did not live long past liberation. They were just too emaciated and ill to survive. So in the end, maybe we had 50,000 direct survivors liberated on German soil who were still alive a few weeks after the end of the war. They were joined then by a very small number, maybe 15,000 German Jewish survivors, of whom about half actually were in Berlin, who were people who had been in hiding, who had passed as so-called Aryans, people who survived during forced labor, who were in so-called privileged mixed marriages. That was another population. So that's really the initial group that constitutes the survivor community in occupied Germany. And the larger population, which we now estimate at around 250,000, probably Jewish survivors and people who were then defined as displaced persons, actually didn't start arriving until late 1945, and then in even larger numbers in 46, and then reaching a peak in 1940, in the summer of 46. And those people, and this is so important because we we don't often emphasize this enough. Those people were, for the most part, not what we might call direct survivors. The great majority of these Jews who made it into occupied Germany, mostly into the American zone, and who were then classified as DPs or displaced persons, were mostly East European Jews, mostly Polish, who had survived precisely because they had not endured the war under Nazi control, but in the Soviet Union. It's a very complicated story, which maybe I can come back to in the Q&A. But these were people who had fled at the beginning of the war in 1939, or who had ended up on the Soviet side of the Polish border after the division of Poland in the summer of 1939. And they had endured an extraordinarily difficult existence, first in Siberia and then in Central Asia. But they had, many of them, not all of them, survived. They were repatriated to Poland and faced renewed anti-Semitism and a vast graveyard, realizing that their communities, their families, their loved ones were dead and that there really was no home left for them to come home to. And they then came as so-called infiltrees. They then came into the American zone, and that became really the core of this quite large, by the end of 1946, they were a significant proportion of the so-called last million, about a quarter at least of the last million of displaced persons. So it's a complicated story with people with very, very varied experiences, from German Jews who had never left their own country, so to speak, to people who had never ever been in Germany and arrived, from the Soviet Union via what had been their home in Poland. And they all gathered together then in these DP communities, and then slowly also in small German communities.
Well, first of all, let me add my thanks to the Holocaust and Human Rights Museum in Dallas for inviting me to participate. And thanks, Atina, for that really important context. I'll speak a little bit about the survivors who came to the United States, and approximately 140,000 came here. They came in stages. In the end of 1945, President Truman was getting pressure from Jewish groups to help the survivors. And so he issued the Truman Directive, and that allowed the first group of about 35,000 Jewish survivors to come to the United States, and that lasted. People came through the Truman Directive for about 3 years. But then the Displaced Persons Act were also, Congress passed those in 1948 and 1950, and that allowed the remaining 85 or so thousand. And then actually there was another spike in 1956 after the Hungarian Revolution, where some Hungarian Jews immigrated to this country. And I also discovered in the course of my research that there were some survivors who had gone to Palestine, became Israel, and then during the austerity period in the 50s, left Israel and came to the United States. So there was a lot of movement in those years. Now, in 1946, an organization called the United Service for New Americans was established. And this was actually the largest social service agency outside of the Red Cross at the time. And it was created, combined the National Refugee Service and the National Council of Jewish Women merged to create USNA. And USNA was responsible basically for helping survivors settle around the country. And most survivors wanted to stay in New York. And in fact, more than half did, more than 50%, because of the Jewish infrastructure, because they had relatives, for a variety of reasons. But some 40% were resettled with the help of USNA around the country. And the way it worked was that USNA worked with local cooperating Jewish agencies all over the country, in big cities and small communities. And these agencies in various communities around the country would help supervise survivors and get them settled. I would just want to add a little bit about demographics. The average age of survivors when they came to this country, according to studies done by USNA and its subsidiary, the New York Association for New Americans, who was created in 1949 after the first DP Act to work with survivors who stayed in New York. And according to USNA Niana, the average age of survivors was 29, and there were more men than women survivors. That's slightly different when it comes to the question of children, which we'll get to soon. But so, yeah.
If I just could piggyback for one moment onto what Beth was saying, I think what you are hearing is that it took quite a while before the United States opened up to Jewish survivors at all, which is why we have the story of the DPs in Germany. And then it's only after several years really that that story can actually start to move.
And I just want to add one thing that, there were survivors not in the American zone. And by and large, the group that came to the United States were Eastern European. Those from France and Belgium and Holland tended, if there were any survivors, tended to stay in their country of origin. That's, again, it was a separate situation for children.
So let's talk a little bit about those demographics, right? I actually kind of wanted to split that up in two. Is first talking about the children, right? Is were these children without parents? And if they were, how did they navigate this new world with having either been in hiding or having been away, faced war, faced genocide? How did, both in Germany and in the United States, how did they face with that? And then I think it's interesting that Dr. Cohen mentioned also women, because we often talk about the male experience and men in this, but in that same sense, I want to add that, how was that experience different for women as well? Was there other challenges from going to the US, from being in Germany in the DP camps? Were there other challenges in that immediate post-war period that both children and women faced?
Well, let me...
Beth, go ahead.
Yeah, it just so happens I've spent 10 years researching the experiences of children, which resulted in my book, Child Survivors of the Holocaust. We know that 1.5 million children, Jewish children, European Jewish children, were murdered. And roughly 150,000 survived. Out of those, even though the images of orphans, war orphans is what we saw predominantly in the press, actually early studies showed that only about 25 to 30%, or anywhere between a quarter to a third of children were orphans, and the rest had surviving parents or parent, in most cases, obviously, one parent. And out of those, it gets a little tricky to try to determine how many children came to the United States. The Truman Directive, which I mentioned earlier, gave preference to orphans. It gave 1,000 quotas to orphans. So we believe at least 1,000 came under the Truman Directive, and then others came later with families. But looking at records of the Claims Conference and child survivor organizations, we think that there are around 50,000, maybe more, child survivors in the United States. So it's also, a hugely complicated story of what happened to the children. And, of course, there were very few young children who survived. Most of the children that survived camps, for example, were teenagers, so they had some agency in their actions. There was an organization that it was actually a subsidiary of USNA called the European Jewish Children's Aid, and the EJCA was responsible for helping children come to the United States, and they reported to the government. They supervised the children's placements, and these reports on the children are really a wonderful source of information into what happened to children. So there was this big bureaucracy for helping children and adults. And, even with the best intentions, I have to say that it was a very fraught process. I've looked at these records. I've interviewed hundreds of child survivors, and the experience really for children coming to the United States went from reasonably good to utterly miserable. There were studies by various Jewish family and children's services that showed that a significant number of children that were placed with foster families were removed from the foster families and sent on to other families. One woman I interviewed arrived here when she was 7. By the time she graduated from high school, she'd been in 4 different placements. And she said, no one wanted an orphan. These were children who had been traumatized, who suffered tremendous loss. And it wasn't just the loss of their parents, but many of children that below teenage years survived because they hid with non-Jewish families, and often they bonded with these families. So another trauma was then being removed from those families and sent to the United States, and having had to readjust to living in a new family where there were often biological siblings of the parents who had taken them in. So it was an extremely complicated story. And again, depending on age, gender, child's experience in Europe, who they were placed with, and often the families they went to were relatives, but relatives they had never met. I will say this, that children, unlike adults, came to the United States and they moved right into the educational system generally. So they went to school here, they learned English quickly, they eventually spoke usually without accents. They married other, generally Americans, not other survivors like the older survivors did. They often went on to college. They were able to acculturate much more easily, at least externally, than adult survivors did.
Yeah. At the beginning, there were virtually no or very, very few young children among the survivors, for all the reasons that we know, that it was virtually impossible to survive in a camp or not be selected for immediate death along with your mother, generally. There were the children who came into the DP camps directly from camps, or who had been liberated on the roads or from death marches, tended to be, as Beth said, they tended to be teenagers who had somehow managed to pass for being older than they actually were. And there was sort of quite a lot of debate about, well, at what age does one stop being a child? And clearly, sort of conventional definitions of childhood didn't even work anymore. The social workers who first had, dealt with and encountered these children were quite flummoxed, because they sort of, on the one hand, they are these sort of wild, unsocialized creatures, it seems, and yet on the other hand, they are old beyond their years. And it was difficult, actually, for the people who wanted to help them to figure out how to help them, especially because I think, as we see in many situations of trauma, these young teenagers actually often found their best support with each other, and they had bonded in peer groups. Sometimes they had wandered, across borders and across political zones, through this war-torn territory together, until they finally found a shelter. That, and then in the DP camps, there were efforts to set up special facilities for these young teenagers. Eventually, actually, they tended to form the core of what would become very, very important Zionist youth movements. It was these young teenagers, or also older teenagers then, who moved into into communities that were called kibbutzim or hachsharat, agricultural farms, to live amongst themselves and with their peers. So there were very few small children. That changed again once you get the influx of those Jews, which was the much larger group. And I have to keep stressing that, because I think we still have this image in our mind of a survivor as someone who perhaps survived in hiding or who survived a camp. But the great majority of the people that we think of as survivors, survived because they had escaped Nazi occupation, which, when you think about it, it makes sense. Where else would 250,000 surviving Jews come from? Not out of Treblinka or Auschwitz or the killing fields of Eastern Europe. So those people who came then from Poland, they did arrive with children. Some of them arrived pregnant. Some of them had already given birth to children and had lost some children in the Soviet Union. Some of them became pregnant on the trek towards the West. So then, sort of rather quickly, the demography of these DP camps changed, and there were children, and there were kindergartens, and aid organizations like the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, or the Umbrella Aid Organization, which was established by the Western Allies already in '43, UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, was sort of scrambling to find everything from layettes to setting up schools. But that happened gradually. And in terms of the specific situation of women, again, I mean, a key issue, which Beth already mentioned, is that in both the case of people who came from the Soviet Union and the direct survivors, there were many more young people than old, and there were more men than women, so there was that imbalance was there from the beginning. But women also faced all of the very specific challenges that we know that women confront in wartime, or in moments of crisis, which is that having survived, they then, particularly for those who were coming from the East, faced renewed threats of particularly sexual violence, actually from liberating soldiers, in particular Red Army soldiers. So there was an additional danger for women that was associated with liberation. Liberation was already such a fraught concept. Many, I'm sure so many survivors will tell you, there was no such thing as liberation. It wasn't sort of like the gates opened one day. This, it happened in different places at different times, and brought with it new traumas and new challenges. So women, everything from having the burden of the children and then having to face new dangers having to do with their sexuality, and then so being, in a sense, at the center of this drive to rebuild what becomes, what we kind of call the baby boom among Jewish survivors, which was this sort of remarkable explosion of pregnancy and births, even though we now realize that some of those babies actually were babies that had been conceived before the end of the war. So these are definitely age and gender specific experiences in so many ways that we could talk about at great length.
Yeah, and I think age and gender are things that we often don't talk about, especially when it comes to Holocaust memory. So let's turn a little bit to that development of that the post-war memory, especially within the public too. One of the things I wanted to talk about is this concept of post-Holocaust silence. I think a lot of people that I talk to, even people who studied the Holocaust, have this understanding that in the immediate post-war years, up and good into the 60s, that there is this silence, that the survivors don't talk about this. Have you found that to be true? What?
No, in a word, no. But, it's interesting because when I first started doing my research, and I worked at a Holocaust center in Rhode Island for 10 years before I went to graduate school. And I had approached my job with that very, same notion that survivors didn't speak, that they had been too traumatized, that they had put all their energy into work and raising families. And it was only later when they reached retirement age, and that's why the oral history programs had developed. But when I started interviewing survivors, I heard over and over again that they wanted to talk about their experiences, but that their sponsors, their family, really didn't want to hear their stories. And what's interesting is that survivors had, I think, such a compelling need to talk about their experiences that they found other ways, and they formed their own groups. In New York, where there were the largest survivor communities, they had what's called Landsmannschaft and hometown social groups, so that survivors from Bialystok or Minsk or Warsaw would get together, and they talked, and they created programs, and they had memorial services in those groups. And everywhere survivors settled, in Dallas, there was a New Texans group that was made up of survivors. And over and over, I heard that when they got into those groups, that's all they talked about, or their wartime. They had such a need to share those experiences that they did. But paradoxically, Atina, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yes, sure, but finish.
Okay, I was going to say that paradoxically, there were things going on in the public sphere that were kind of ran parallel to, I think, what the survivors were experiencing. So there were synagogues had services. They took the liturgy of the service and used those to memorialize the 6 million. There wasn't direct contact with other survivors. But in the public sphere, there was a significant amount of material. First of all, there were images of ships arriving starting in 1946 with the first boatloads of DPs. There were stories, there were pictures, human interest pictures of reunions. There were fundraising campaigns to raise money for the war orphans. A very popular one was called the Adopt a Child program, where they asked people to contribute $1 a day to support orphans in children's homes. And Mayor O'Dwyer of New York jumped on the bandwagon, Bing Crosby, Helen Hayes, and these pictures of celebrities supporting orphans were quite prominent in the press. And there was an effort to build a Warsaw Ghetto monument in New York that eventually fell apart. For the first couple of years, there were tremendous ceremonies with non-Jewish politicians at these events, which got a lot of publicity. There were the Nuremberg trials were in the newspaper. There were books. The Diary of Mary Berg, for example, was the first diary published in 1945, even before the war was over, and it became a Book of the Month Club selection. College students at universities became interested in sponsoring students to their universities. That happened at the University of Michigan, at Dartmouth, at other colleges. Life magazine ran a number of stories that featured survivors in them. There were films. Orson Welles produced a film in 1946 called The Stranger that was about a war crimes investigator that had actual footage of a concentration camp in it. And a Polish film called The Last Stop, which was directed by a woman, told a woman's story of used Auschwitz survivors as actors. So there was a considerable amount of information coming out. Now, we don't know what people read or what they paid attention to, but it certainly was there, and not just in the Jewish circles, but in much wider public landscape.
Yeah, I think we've sort of come to the understanding that this was, as I think it was Hasia Diner who's written wonderfully about Holocaust commemoration in the United States. Was said, it was kind of the silence that never was. Although, as always, there are very individual variations in who spoke when and how much in each family. But I mean, what's clear is that in those very early years, especially when Jews were not yet able, the great majority of the survivors were not yet able to get out of Allied occupied Europe, particularly Germany, also Austria and Italy, either to Palestine or to the United States. The doors were closed in both cases, which was actually the impetus for forming these rather remarkable DP communities in, of all places, the land of the perpetrators. And there, talking about what had happened and commemorating the dead and the murdered was a part of everyday life. I just sort of recall one social worker who wrote in her memoir, she said, "I wish I was a typewriter." Not I wish I had a typewriter, but I wish I had been a typewriter, because There were just these torrents of stories that poured out of people. And some of those were recorded extremely early, whether it was by an American sociologist named Boder, who actually went to the DP camps in Europe with a tape recorder. These tapes are available. You can listen to them actually at on the website of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. But they also established very, very quickly, already in Poland, but then as in the DP camps as well, this extraordinary self-organization of survivors. These were not people who were just emaciated victims. These were people who really became agents in their own story. And they set up so-called historical commissions that made it their duty to collect testimonies. So what we think of today as, the collection of oral histories, the collection of testimonies. I mean, they didn't do video testimonies quite the way, say, the Shoah Foundation did, but the stories of individual survivors, but also they collected artifacts, they collected photographs. They were committed to preserving this memory, and which in a sense was really a continuation of what had already happened during the Holocaust, for example, with the Ringelblum archive in the Warsaw Ghetto, right? So there was always this urge to actually document what had happened. And the historical commissions were both for memory and they were for purposes of justice. I mean, they were used for trials and for evidence in judicial proceedings, but also as memorials. There were memorial ceremonies. There were exhumations of mass graves and reburial processions that took place around camps. Every Jewish holiday, even for people who were not terribly religious, and not all of the survivors were, but they lived by a calendar that made room for memorialization and for the saying of Kaddish and for setting up Yizkor books, and which then traveled, as Beth was saying, to Landsmannschaft. So even though there was this spirit of we have to look forward, and that was very much encouraged then by the Zionist ethos. That really started to dominate in the DP camps. More and more, the longer people were stuck and realized that they probably were not necessarily going to make it to the Golden Medina, to the United States, maybe where they might have preferred to go. So that there was a sense of we have to look forward. We can't just dwell on the past. We can't, wallow in victimization, or for that matter, in acts or fantasies of revenge. One of the sort of famous early speeches by a DP leader was to the youth. The youth were the promise that would redeem the Sherit HaPleta, that would be the saving remnant of the saved remnant. And he said, you must sing, you must dance, you must live. And so that was very important. And that was also part of this drive to reestablish families. Sometimes as people said, sometimes very strange families that never would have, marriages that never would have happened before. But it was always intermingled with not just the sense of mourning and loss, but also with very self-conscious memorials. There were memorials that were built. Every DP camp had memorials. The DP press, which was in Yiddish, printed stories about Palestine and about life in Eretz Yisrael and about the future, but they also printed the stories of what had happened in the camps and ghettos. And I would just say one last thing about this question of silence to sort of relativize what I just said, because we're always, on the one hand and on the other hand. I think where there was a kind of silence was about the experience of, again, the majority of the Jews who had spent the war in the Soviet Union. I mean, that has been exaggerated as well. People did talk about it and they did write about it, and we have evidence of their stories being printed up in DP newspapers as well. But for the most part, once the East European Jews crossed the border, let's say into Poland, and they realized the enormity of what had happened, that then suddenly for them, what had been a horrific series of privations and loss and death and disease and starvation, but not systematic extermination. Very important, right? I mean, it was sort of the horrors of wartime, not necessarily specific to Jews. They were so overwhelmed by realizing what had happened to those that they had left behind, that they tended to close down on their own stories and rather take on the larger narrative of survival under Nazi occupation. So that you would have, for example, actors who had survived in the Soviet Union, but on the DP stages, they would be playing people who had been in Nazi camps, or you'd have poets publishing in DP newsletters about the experience of Nazi occupation when in fact they had not experienced that. So there was so in that sense there was a silence about that experience, which was very painful for this very large group of survivors, which in a sense I think has only been opened up in recent years. So there's, the story is always more complicated. But
Yeah.
I want to add something to that, if I might, about, I also think that there was a lot of silence around the experience of children in this country too. And even though there was initially interest in children, quite a flurry of interest in the images in the paper, people interested in adopting children, but that subsided. And then the child survivors that I interviewed, I discovered that they were not considered survivors because many of them had survived in hiding. It was assumed, first of all, it was assumed, number one, that they wouldn't remember, that they were too young to remember what had happened to them. And they also, because they had survived in hiding, many adults assumed that they had seen the best of human behavior rather than the worst, so that they were okay. Some people simply didn't believe children when they tried to talk about what had happened to them. So children, in a way, as Robert Crowell, the psychiatrist who himself was a hidden child and has written extensively, said, in many ways, children continue to stay in hiding. And it was only in the 1980s when research was done. The first book came out on child survivors by Sarah Moskowitz, who's a child psychologist out here in California. And she coined the term child survivor because Helen Epstein's book about children of survivors had come out at the same time. And there was a lot of confusion about children of survivors and child survivors. So in the 80s, child survivors started forming groups. They started talking to each other. A few years later, the Hidden Child Foundation was established, and there was kind of a groundswell of interest. And again, scholarship reflected that. Deborah Dwork's book on Children with a Star that came out in the 1990s. And since then, there's been much more of an interest in the experience of children. But I would argue that that was also part of the silence initially.
Yeah, I wanted to let the audience know too is that we're also moving into the Q&A portion. So if they want to submit their questions in the Q&A, I can ask those questions to Dr. Cohen and Dr. Grossmann as well. So So please feel free to submit your questions into Q&A. And as we're waiting for those, some of those questions to come in, I wanted to kind of build upon that silence. And you know, now that we're learning that there isn't really that post-Holocaust silence from the survivors, in the sense that they are memorializing, and that there's films and diaries and you know, all of this writing going on, is it then more reflection on the maybe the non-Jewish public or the non-survivor public? What was kind of, I guess, the awareness and the acknowledgement of the Holocaust, really in those immediate post-war years, and then, you know, going through building up. I'm like, today we have, you know, all these big films and movies and everything, but you know, we just learned from you now that these things are out there too. But you know, so is it more a reflection on that? So what was that acknowledgement and awareness in the public?
I mean, certainly Germany, which was a defeated, you know, a thoroughly defeated, collapsed Reich, right? I mean, you know, 1,000-year Reich that that went down in flames, and so it was a combination of Allied bombing and the force of the Red Army, that for the very most part, Germans themselves were utterly preoccupied with their own misery. And they saw themselves as the primary victims. I mean, they saw themselves as the victims, first of all, of their own leadership, which they had, for the most part, followed to the bitter end. Whether, you know, with whatever degree of skepticism or not, but they had remained loyal, and they had kept on fighting even when it was quite clear that that the war was lost. But they felt that somehow they had been betrayed by Hitler, by these promises that were not kept. They certainly felt themselves to be victimized by the Allies in different ways, by the Soviets, who were seen as more brutal, and certainly in the case of sexual violence and mass rape, that was certainly the case. And women paid, you know, a different price, in a sense, for, it was kind of a gender defeat, as I called it in one of my chapters. So, but they saw in a very, to us, perverse way, that once they saw that Jewish survivors were being gathered into DP camps, which for the Jews initially were, you know, also places of safety and continued incarceration to a certain degree, because they were safe, but they were safe behind barbed wire. They felt like, oh, they're the privileged ones. They're the ones who are getting aid from the Allies. They're the ones who are being assisted by American Jewish or British Jewish chaplains and enlisted men. They're getting better rations. They are the ones who are being housed in houses and on land that was confiscated by us, which was true. I mean, the Allies, and certainly the Americans were, and Eisenhower in particular, were very clear about this, that they, you know, would confiscate German homes and use them to house DPs. So so there was a kind of, I mean, the word that kept getting used by, you know, a vast array of journalists and observers is this kind of sense of a sullen acceptance of defeat without a real coming to terms. There's a very well-known, you know, Jewish observer who wrote a piece early on where he talked about the enigma of German irresponsibility. Hannah Arendt, you know, famously, this is a little later, 1950, in an article that was actually called The Aftermath of Nazi Rule, spoke about a flight from responsibility, escape from responsibility, and even sort of spoke about an inability to mourn on the part of the Germans, in the sense they couldn't mourn their own losses, which also made it impossible for them to see. They were forced to see at the beginning by the Allies. You know, you do have those famous processions where German civilians are schlepped through the camps. There were the newsreels that people were expected to see. There was a denazification program. For the most part, those early initiatives didn't take, they didn't last very long. And so, yes, there was, if anything, no silence. It was a selective silence, as historians have said. There was no silence about the miseries of war or the humiliations of a lost war, but there was a kind of unwillingness to really take responsibility, which then in turn was only, in a sense, exacerbated by this larger influx of Jews that came starting in late 1945 and then 46, which to us, of course, seems like, you know, this very, very small percentage. If we think, say, that Poland had Jewish population of 3.5 to 3.3 to 3.5 million Jews, and maybe 330,000 of them, 10%, survived in one form or another. And of those, probably 80% of those who had survived had survived in the Soviet Union. And a significant portion of that population in turn then moved west. And at that point, Germans were wont to say, wait a minute, you know, you've been telling us that we were, you know, we killed all these Jews and we're supposed to feel guilty. And now, so where do all these people come from that seem to be gathering in the squares of our town, that are active on the black market, which was actually the only way of engaging in any economic activity in post-war Germany? There was no legitimate market in that sense, who are populating our villages or camps on the outskirts of our villages. And these people are not, you know, they're not victims of Germans. They're not victims of the Nazis. They're economic migrants. They just want a better life. For some reason, Americans, you know, we have a tradition that Americans must be a place where people can come for better lives. But then when they're people who we don't necessarily want, we think that they're just economic migrants. And the Germans said, well, either they're running away from the communists or they just want a better life, but they're not our problem. So that really did take a very long time. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't, you know, again, long, complicated question, long-winded answers that we don't have time for. Certainly there were efforts to, whoops, I just lost. Sorry, I just got lost.
We can still see you,
Oh,
Atina.
you can? Okay,
Yeah.
I just need to get.
And we can see and hear you. Yeah.
Okay, let me get out of this. Sorry, thank you. Where am I?
Well,
Sure.
since we're
Here I am, I'm back.
because we are right, it is 8 p.m. and we did have 3 questions coming in, so I want to make sure that we have time for the questions too. Want to let Dr. Cohen maybe talk a little bit too about the United States side and the public's reaction and awareness and acknowledgement of the Holocaust too.
Well, as I said earlier, there certainly was evidence, you know, in the public eye of the Holocaust, you know, through films, through books, through newsreels. But I think that it wasn't front and center in the conversation, certainly in the Jewish community and also in the wider community. And I think that, post-war, it was the baby boom. People were looking ahead. Soldiers coming back. Many people were looking forward and didn't want to dwell on the horrors of the war. I think that started to change in the 70s, in part due to the efforts to promote Holocaust education. And it's interesting because Holocaust education, it's now mandated in 16 states, but it really started by local initiatives by individual teachers. And it was a source, everybody agreed that there should be Holocaust education, but how to go about teaching the Holocaust was a contentious subject. And I think that the drive to universalize the lessons of the Holocaust are actually what gave the Holocaust in many ways wider appeal, because it wasn't just a Jewish story anymore. It could be everybody's story, and everybody could learn about the lessons of the Holocaust. And so that fostered Holocaust education, and to some extent, I think it fostered museums. The U.S. Holocaust, the Commission for the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum started in 1979 and eventually opened its doors in 93. And at the same time, local Holocaust centers, virtually every state now has a Holocaust center, one type, or resource center, museums. And I think it's part of the sense that it's everybody's story now.
Yeah, I think it took a very long time in Germany to be institutionalized, for Holocaust memory to be institutionalized. And we shouldn't forget that in many ways that forgetting was also aided and abetted by the Cold War. And by the fact that very quickly the denazification program, which had been fairly rigorous at the beginning, fell victim to the necessity of rebuilding a West Germany, which would be an ally to the West, to this movement of, as one British writer called it, changing enemies. So that very quickly the Soviet Union, which had been an ally, became the new enemy. I mean, that sort of was instantiated by 1948 with the Berlin blockade and the Berlin airlift. So that also contributed to a lack of confrontation in Germany, which only happens slowly. It really starts in 1961 with the Auschwitz trials. And then I think in some rather fundamental way, only with this, famous American Hollywood TV, docudrama, the Holocaust, which was shown actually to extraordinary response in 1978 already or late in Germany. Situation is a little different in the East, in the German Democratic Republic, or what had been the Soviet zone of occupation, and then the GDR, which created a culture of remembrance, but it was one that was steeped in an anti-fascist narrative. And didn't really focus on the specificity of Jewish experience, although there were probably more prominent German Jews in public life in the GDR than there were in West Germany. And that connects, and this is, I think one other question that somebody was asking in the chat.
Yeah, and I think, because I think what you're talking about now is actually fitting in with a question that came in from Carol, is what the reception was to, of not just, the general public, but the townspeople where refugees were flooding in from the East, right? Is what is the immediate reaction to?
Right. And I saw that, right. And so I think that, this was why I called my book, Jews, Germans, and Allies, Close Encounters in Occupied Germany. Actually, I wanted to call it Close Encounters the other way, but they told me people would think it was, about ET or something. So that's part of the paradox, if you will, that Jews were very quickly after the war ended a present and visible part of the German landscape or of the city or of the cityscape. In other words, they were not all corpses. They were not all dead as far as the Germans were concerned. They saw the survivors, the DPs on the streets. They interacted with them. One very important site of interaction was the black market, where goods were traded. And it is true, Jews had access to American goods that Germans wanted. Germans had access to things like fresh milk and fresh vegetables that Jews desperately wanted. They didn't want to just live on white bread and Spam, which is what they were, being given as their rations. But they interacted in other ways that are more surprising as well, which is that the baby boom that depended actually on the services of, first of all, German doctors and nurses, because there were very few, especially at the beginning, Jewish doctors and nurses available, and also on German nannies and German housekeepers who were actually working for Jews in the DP camps. And increasingly over time, as about 25% of Jewish survivors actually moved out of the camps into German towns and cities in private households. And this was a double-edged thing, phenomenon. On the one hand, it was a kind of revenge in a way, that Jews said, we spent so much time working for the Germans, or having to work maybe in the Soviet Union because of the Germans. Now let the Germans work for us. But at the same time, and this is where the question of gender comes in again, having someone take care of your precious post-Holocaust, post-Shoah, post-catastrophe baby, and have that be a German woman was also a very fraught experience. And it speaks to the fact that so many of these young couples were very young. They were very inexperienced. They didn't have their families. They didn't have their mothers, their aunts, their siblings, their parents, for the most part, who would help them. And so they would interact with German women. And you also had Jewish survivors who went to German universities and got medical degrees and engineering degrees. You had sports competitions. There was a lot of everyday pragmatic contact, but these were not serious relationships. They were also, there were actually sexual encounters, mostly Jewish men and German women. There was some, genuine romances that ended in marriage. But for the most part, when I would talk to Jews, they would say, "Oh, we didn't know any Germans." And then I would say, "But wait a minute, here's this whole long list of people who were employed in the camp, and look at all the German women who were taking care of your children." And they would say, "Oh, well, yes, of course, but we didn't have any relationship with them." The children who grew up in those DP camps, and some of them friends of mine, for example, would actually kept those relationships sometimes for decades with their nannies. So there was a sense of the presence of survivors and of Jews in Germany, but it didn't translate into a serious confrontation with what had happened. It was a pragmatic living together coexistence. There was some violence, there were acts of revenge, but that was not the dominant phenomenon. And it was very much premised, and this I think is the key point about, the population in Germany, maybe as my final point. It was really premised on the fact that this was a temporary situation.
Yeah.
And that most of these Jews would leave, and that Germany would kind of get its country back, as it were, which it did when it was no longer occupied officially, or in different, again, East and West is different. So there were a remarkable number of close encounters.
Yeah.
But they were not of a lasting sort. And the great majority, as Beth has already said, the great majority of the survivors left again. By 1949, there's maybe 30,000, both German and East European DP Jews left.
We're technically already out of time, but there was one more big question that came in, and I want to kind of, flip it to the end, back to kind of that memory, and back into the United States, and kind of wrap it up. So I think it's a perfect ending question, but very short. Dr. Cohen, would you be able to answer? One of our participants this evening asked, my father was a child survivor hiding in Germany. Although he was very young, he had very vivid memories. He didn't talk about his time until prompted when I was a young adult and asked him to write it down. He felt his story was nothing anyone would be interested in, as it was just part of his life he went through, like a child through kindergarten. Dr. Cohen, did you find any other child survivors who felt that way?
Yes, certainly. And I think that speaks in part to what I was talking about earlier about the silence among children who didn't really feel that their story was valuable. And also, as I had mentioned at the outset, that some children, the majority of children really were not orphans, and they were in families that had one or sometimes two survivor parents. So there were two generations of survivors really under one roof, but the younger generation, the children, were not thought of survivors, and they tended to think that their parents were the ones who had all the difficulties. And so by contrast, their experiences in their minds were minimized.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Dr. Cohen and Dr. Grossmann, for such a wealth of information. I learned so much tonight, and so many interesting aspects. And thank you for joining our program and sharing all of this information. I think this is so key in our full understanding of not just postwar, but the Holocaust itself as well. I'm going to turn it back over to Annie Black, who is going to wrap it all up for us.
Thank you so much. I will echo my Charlotte's thanks to Beth and to Atina, but also to Charlotte for her skillful moderating as always. Thank you all so much for being with us. Thank you in the audience as well. Hope everyone has a very safe and happy holiday season. If you're celebrating, happy almost Hanukkah. Stay safe, stay well, and we will see you all next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.